Hey, welcome back to the Fantasy Ball Profits. This is our Week 5 daily fantasy video. We're going to get to some names of people that you can consider guys that are good deals out there so you can be successful and hopefully win some money at daily fantasy. At the end of the video, we're going to talk about last week, some of the names that we suggested, and just kind of recap how we did. But before we get into our first slide, we want to talk about an organization that we are partnering with called Thrive Fantasy. Matt, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I've actually downloaded their app. They also are on the web. Thrive Fantasy is a new spin on fantasy football. I'm not going to spoil it for you. I gave you guys a bit of a breakdown last week during the daily fantasy video. But Thrive Fantasy is a new take on it. There's a link below in the description if you want to sign up, if you want to check it out for yourself. If you do sign up, they'll match your first $10 deposit if you go through the link below in the description. It's a great way to get a bonus starting out, and it's a great way to support this channel. But without further ado, let's get into our rankings, starting off with quarterbacks. So first up for quarterbacks, I want to go over some value picks. I have a couple other ones in here that will be, solid plays, more expensive plays. But this week, I think among all the positions, the most value can be found in the quarterback position. And that's not always true. First up on this list, and I think Rob has this on his list as well, I think the top value play this week across the board, Joe Flacco. He's actually one of the cheapest quarterbacks, which blows my mind. One of the cheapest quarterbacks this week can cost you somewhere from 10 to 11% of your salary. And by the way, we use percentages because I know you guys are on all sorts of different platforms, and not everybody has a $100 cap or $200 cap or $55,000, whatever your cap is. We just use percentages to make it simple for you guys. Joe Flacco is one of the cheapest ones, which usually you see like a rookie, like a Josh Rosen down there or something like this. This week it's Joe Flacco, one of the cheapest, 10 to 11%. That's surprising. He's been averaging over 300 yards a game this year, and he's playing the Browns this week. I mean, that's the same Browns defense, which by no means is in the basement in terms of defenses this year. They've had some good games, but last week they gave up 437 yards to Derek Carr. 4 touchdowns. They did get 2 interceptions, but I think this week it's right for the picking. And again, it's a value play, very cheap play in Joe Flacco. The next one on my list is Andy Dalton. Actually, both of these guys were on my list last week. Again, Andy Dalton, fairly inexpensive this week, 13 to 14% of your salary, going up against a Miami defense that, to be quite honest, did not look good at all against New England. Well, that was New England. That was Tom Brady. I mean, this is Andy Dalton. This is Cincinnati. With that being said, though, I think this game is going to be a lot closer than last week, and I think that's going to bode well for Andy Dalton. Not necessarily a high-scoring game, but he's going to put up some decent numbers. He's going to get plenty of attempts, passing attempts, and all in all, I think, again, a good value play. Now, the final value play on my list, this is a bit of a risk, this is a bit of a gamble, is Marcus Mariota. He's only, I think, played in 3 games this year. His first 2 games were just garbage fantasy-wise, I think a little over 100 yards each. Last week, though, he did rebound. He had a good passing game. And I think the big bonus with Mariota is the threat that he poses on the ground, whether it's touchdowns or even just yards. 50-yard, 70-yard games are not all that uncommon for a quarterback like Mariota. And so I think it is a bit of a gamble, but again, it's not a bad value play either. He's 11 to 12% of your salary, so not bad by any means. Real quick, I do want to go over my solid picks this week for more pricier quarterbacks. If you want to spend money at quarterback position this week. Real quick, my 4 picks would be, first of all, Ben Roethlisberger, going up against a very weak Atlanta defense. At least against the pass, I think he's a pretty good pick. On the other side of the ball, Matt Ryan, he's been having a great year. And again, going up against what I see as a very weak pass defense on Pittsburgh. Matt Stafford, he's considerably cheaper than those two, somewhere between 15 to 16% of your salary. Going up against the Packers defense, I think it's going to be an all-around good game. It's going to be a relatively high-scoring affair. They're each going to put up a couple touchdowns on the board, or the Packers are going to route to a lead and Lions play catch-up. And I think that bodes well for Stafford as well. I don't see the Lions, blowing out the Packers necessarily this week. And so I think Stafford is, all around going to have a good game. He's quite a bit cheaper than those 2 that I just mentioned. And then the final one would be Rivers going up against the Oakland defense. The same Oakland defense that gave up over 40 points last week to the Browns. And so I think he's a pretty solid play as well. But again, all 4 of those guys, A little bit pricier. The value this week I see is in the quarterback position. What's your take on it, Rob?
So yeah, I'm going to start right out with Joe Flacco. I agree with you. He's only going to cost you about 10 to 11% of your salary cap. I'm not excited about this pick per se. There's a few reasons why. One, the Browns defense is underrated, although like you said last week, they were exposed by the Raiders. I fear at times could this be a blowout. There's other factors there. I think when it comes right down to it, I think Baltimore is going to want to win games by running the ball, playing defense. But so far, like you said, he's had success in the air. But for me, he's the best, most trustworthy veteran out there that's going to come as cheap as you can get. Now, personally, for me, when I play this, I try not to invest a lot of money in the quarterbacks. Now, every once in a while, if I'm not comfortable with the bargains out there, I might invest. But typically, I like to go cheap. So for me, Joe Flacco is probably who I'm going to run in all my scenarios this week. Another guy out there is Derek Carr. Derek Carr is going to cost you about 14% of your salary cap. He's a moderate value playing the Chargers. Now, in the preseason, we would have said this is a bad matchup. The Chargers defense is very good, but that defense has taken a step backwards. They are struggling. They missed Joey Bosa. They've been badly exposed. So I think Derek Carr is a nice play there. Last week, he had over 400 yards, and actually, he's looking better and better each week. I think that John Gruden's really kind of getting that system together, and they're starting to work some things out there. Another guy out there that I'm not a big fan of, but I think this week I love him, is Blake Bortles. He's going to cost you about 13 to 14% of your salary cap. He plays in Kansas City. Now this year he's had 2 terrible games. He's had 2 really good games. He's very predictable this year and last year. He struggles against good pass defenses, and he can have some very good games against some weaker pass defense. Now he plays Kansas City as a defense that he should be able to expose, and he should be able to put some points on the board there.
I should add, Kansas City, one of the best teams in the league this year. They're probably going to win the game, I would guess, which means Bortles is going to be playing from behind, and that's really where he has shined throughout his career, is playing in garbage time, down 2 touchdowns, 3 touchdowns, and so that could be a good game for him, even if they get blown out.
Yeah, so yeah, I like Blake Bortles once again. I like him overall as a quarterback, but in this matchup, he's great. And then another one out there that I'm going to stay away from, but some of you are going to be okay with this guy, and that's Ryan Tannehill. Going to cost you 30% of your salary against the Bengals. The Bengals defense is not good. Andy Dalton should be able to move the ball, put points on the board. I think Ryan's going to have to play a little bit of catch up there, and so he's one that a lot of you be comfortable going with. So those are some guys that I like. If I talk about a guy that I would invest in, who I feel is like safe money, Ben Roethlisberger, I think he's going to have a great week. I think another one out there that is a very safe play is Jared Goff. Jared Goff out there, and another guy I like out there, but these guys cost you a little bit of money, is Tom Brady. Now, he struggled the first few weeks, but I think a lot of that had nothing to do with him. They had some injuries at running back. Their wide receivers were out. Well, now, of course, he's got Josh Gordon in the mix, and Julian Edelman comes back this week. They're playing the Colts at home. So I think that's safe money, as I would call it.
Yeah, so yeah, I would agree.
All right, let's get to our running backs.
Sounds good. So first up for running backs this week in value plays is the same guy that I think I talked about first last week. That's Lamar Miller. Again, it's just because of how inexpensive he is. It's not because he's the most explosive player in the league. It's not because I think he's going to put up huge numbers week in and week out. It's just that, this week he's going to cost you somewhere from 7 to 8% of your salary. He's inexpensive, and he gets touches. He gets some through the air. He gets a fair amount of carries, and he's a bit of a touchdown threat. I mean, he's going to get the ball. He's cheap. There's not very many people that check those boxes. I mean, he doesn't share a whole lot of carries with Alfred Blue. Alfred Blue, he just doesn't get very many carries each game, not very many yards. He hasn't really proven himself as somebody that can split, an even split with Lamar Miller. So he's kind of my first value pick, kind of a touchdown dependent guy. I mean, maybe 6, 7 points, 8 points for sure. And then on top of that is, if he has a good game or if he scores a touchdown. So I think he's a good value play. Next up on this list is Carlos Hyde. He is, last week I think he could have had a bigger game, but I think it was Nick Chubb had a really long touchdown run, and he had a good week, and I think he's kind of being overshadowed by some other backs in the league right now, and I think he's going to have a solid season. The Browns' offense is not as dysfunctional as some people, including myself, thought it would be at this point in the season. I think he's a solid pick this week, 12 to 13% of your salary. Again, pretty inexpensive, considering that he very well could have as good of a week as somebody that is, a full 5% more expensive than he is. Next up on this list, I have Deion Lewis. Now on the ground, especially last week, he has not done all that well. But I think last week he had something like 9 receptions. Okay, he's got some serious PPR value, and I think he's a great guy to consider. Again, like 8% of your salary, so not very expensive. And then finally on this list is T.J. Yeldon. I think you have him on here as well, mostly because Fournette's out. going to be out this week. They recently announced that. So I'd absolutely consider playing Yeldon in a lot of your scenarios. I think he's not the most explosive player, but he's inexpensive, 11% of your salary, and he actually had a pretty good week last week. So those are my value plays. And then my one solid play that I want to talk about this week is not Todd Gurley. It's not Alvin Kamara. It's not Melvin Gordon. It's a guy that I think this season has kind of been overshadowed. People aren't talking about him as much as they're talking about those players, and it's Ezekiel Elliott. He's actually had a really solid season thus far. He's like those players. He's been doing quite a bit on the ground, but he's also been getting a fair amount of targets and receptions. He's got some PPR value, and I think he's going to continue to perform well on the Dallas offense. And he's just a guy that not a lot of people talk about. And I think this week he's less expensive than all of those guys that I just mentioned: Gurley, Gordon, Kamara. If you're playing the Monday night game in your league, he's only 15% of your salary, so he'd kind of be my solid pick this week. That's not all that expensive. Who do you have in your list this week?
Yeah, so before getting into my running backs, the one thing I would advise you out there to do in daily fantasy is you have to stay flexible. And here's what we mean by that. Later in the week, like on Friday, Saturday, injury reports come in. We get new updates. A guy that was started or slated to play can all of a sudden be out. Before you know it, all his backup has value that you could get very cheap. We see that with Bernard, we saw that with Yeldon, other guys who suddenly now you can put in there for very cheap and reinvest that money that now you saved at that position. So don't get so stubborn. Set your lineup early in the week, that's fine. But you know what? Throughout the week, continue to check up on it. Look for value plays, look for reinvestment, stay flexible. I think that's really important to be successful in daily fantasy.
Yeah, I agree.
So I want to talk about Kerryon Johnson as a guy that I like out there. He's going to cost you about 9 to 10% of your salary cap. He plays the Packers this week. This is a guy that's been very productive. Last week he had 9 carries, 6.1 yards per carry, a touchdown. He's a very talented 3-down back. For me, the only question is when are the Lions going to commit to giving him the ball? Last week they should have beat the Dallas Cowboys. I don't know why they didn't commit to using him more. He had 9 carries, was effective. Yet they gave LeGarrette Blount 7 carries for a measly 11 yards. So I think I love this guy. He's very talented. He's been successful. He's thriving that offense, and I think you're going to see an increased workload right now, and I think he's got a great matchup. Another one out there, and I love this guy. I'm probably going to roll him out in almost all my scenarios, and that's Sony Michel. It's going to cost you about 9 or 10% of your salary out there. He's versus Indianapolis this week on Thursday night. 3 consecutive weeks of increased his carries and his yards. He was productive. Last week he had over 100 yards and a touchdown. The key right there, and I think why I love this guy moving forward, is you got Rex Burkett, you got Jeremy Allen are on the IR. They've had a lot of injuries there, and so this guy's going to be a workhorse going forward. And that hasn't always been the case for for Patriot running backs, where it's often been a running back by committee. It's hard to pin down who's going to get the carries. I think due to a lot of injuries and a lack of productivity with other backs, I think he's going to be their go-to guy going forward. I love him. And then TJ Yeldon, like you said, going to cost you about 11% of your cap. Plays Kansas City, who gives up a lot of points. Now, Leonard Fournette is out. He's not as good of a pure running back as Leonard Fournette, but he's actually much better in the passing game than Leonard. This guy is very active there. He's got good hands, and so I think he's a real good play. And then there's Kareem Hunt. Been overlooked. This is a guy that in the preseason was considered an RB1 last year. He was top 5 in scoring. Struggled a little bit with his yards per carry for a few weeks. People kind of got so excited about Pat Mahomes. Forgot all about this guy. Last week he blows up. Now he's playing the Jags. That might scare some of me because the Jags have a very good defense. But if you look at last year, if there's an area where the Jags could be exposed, it was against running backs. So they had some games where quality running backs would blow up against them. And so I think he's so cheap. I think that he's a guy that you can get a really good deal out there. And I think he's somewhere around 12% of your cap space, which is incredibly cheap for a guy like him. And so another thing that bodes well for him is Pat Mahomes continues to impress and be productive. I think you're going to see more and more of those running lanes open up. His defenses have to begin to start, instead of sneaking a safety up. I think early in the year they probably loaded the box, tried to force the rookie to beat them through the air. Well, he's proven he can do that. And so now I think that's going to soften defenses a little bit there. So I like him. I also like David Johnson. David Johnson is going to cost you about 13% of your salary cap. He plays San Francisco. I know a lot of owners are worried about David Johnson. I can see why, but he's their best weapon on that team by far. That offense is going to make adjustments. They are going to improve. And for him to get 20 to 25 touches per game is very reasonable. Another one out there I like is James Conner. Going to cost you about 13 to 40% of your salary cap. Now, the last couple of weeks, this guy's really taken a step back after a huge week 1, but he's at home versus an Atlanta defense that has been very depleted by injuries to key players. So I like him. I think James Conner rebounds this week in a big way. I think he's a good value. And then Christian McCaffrey. He's going to cost you about 14% of your salary cap. versus the Giants. So in the offseason, he put on some weight because the one knock of this guy, he's a little bit smaller, he's about 205. Can you handle that workload? Well, he put on some weight, he put on some muscle so he could handle the increased workload. Well, sure enough, they've increased his workload and he's responded, he's been effective. This is a guy that's very talented. He's got just as much talent. He's right below that level of Kamara, Gurley, and Gordon. The difference is he's a lot cheaper. He's about half that price in some leagues. So I like him. And then the final guy I don't like right now, but I might later in the week, and that's Mike Davis. Currently, he's only going to cost you 7 to 8% of your salary cap versus the Rams. He's only valuable if Chris Carson's out, and we don't know that. So watch that one later in the week and see if that becomes a value for you.
Yeah, and I should add, circling back to David Johnson, he's another guy that at the beginning of the season, he was in the RB1 conversation. But because of their struggles with Sam Bradford for a while and now Rosen, people kind of forget about him. But I think he's still the same running back as what back in 2016 when he had his really good year, and I think we're going to see that eventually this year.
Yeah, I think so.
So let's move on to wide receivers. So starting out with wide receivers, my first one on this list for value plays is another guy that I had last week because he continues to be, I think, underpriced. Undervalued, and that's Tyler Boyd from Cincinnati. About 10% of your salary. This guy is getting targets galore. He got 15 targets last week. I mean, this entire season, he's been trending up. We know that trend can't continue indefinitely. But I don't think that this has just been a fluke. I think we know 4 games to the season that it's more than just a fluke. Maybe it's defenses focusing too much on Green, and so they're just throwing him the ball more. He's open more often, but he's been getting a ton of targets. He's been very productive, and at 10% of your salary, I think he's an excellent pick. Another guy that's been getting a lot of targets, a lot of receptions this year is Nelson Aguilar. Now, I actually watched him part of the game last week. I forget exactly who they were playing. I think the Titans. Philly was playing the Titans. And I think he recorded 5 receptions, 12 targets, 5 receptions for 22 yards. Not a spectacular day. But if you go back and watch the game, there were actually 2 pretty significant receptions. I think they would have been 20 yards each, 15 yards each down the field, and he could have run after that he just barely missed. I mean, the ball was there just a split second too late. I'd chalk it up to excellent defense from the Titans and not poor catching ability, not poor route running or anything like that on Nelson Aguilar's behalf. He could have had a huge game last week, and I think he's going to continue to garner quite a few targets and receptions this week against Vikings defense that's coming off of a long week, 10 days off or whatever after their Thursday night game. But against the Rams, they look pretty leaky, that pass defense. So he's definitely on this list. Also on this list is Alshon Jeffrey, another Philadelphia wide receiver. Just came back from his injury last week, put up huge numbers. But he's 10% of your salary. I think he continues to be undervalued just because whoever it is, the fantasy football gods or whatever that create these numbers, they create these salaries. They're just not willing to give him a higher value yet because he just came back. And so I think he's undervalued this week, again, against a Vikings defense that could prove to be pretty leaky once again against Wentz. I also have John Brown up here for the Ravens going up against the Browns. I mean, this is really dependent on how big of numbers Joe Flacco puts up. But he's kind of, we talked about this a bit last week, but I think he's kind of head and shoulders above the other wide receivers in Baltimore now. I mean, Crabtree continues to garner targets and receptions, but the numbers just don't compare. Same thing goes for Snead. And so I think he's a pretty good pick this week, about 11% of your salary. All 3 of those guys right around the same price. And then finally, one other one that I want to talk about is this Atlanta-Pittsburgh game, namely Atlanta receivers. Now, you have Julio Jones, who is going to be the most expensive on Atlanta's team. He always gets a lot of targets. He gets a lot of receptions. Not a whole lot of touchdowns. I mean, that's like the thing about him is, for whatever reason, the Ryan Jones connection it works out great, except in the red zone or except when he needs to score a touchdown. And instead, it's been the running backs or the tight ends or the other receivers that have been getting a lot of touchdowns. Now, last week we had Ridley, actually, that we picked as our value play that week, and he ended up doing very well. I think he caught 2 touchdowns. But I got the sense that it very well could have gone the other way for him. It ended up turning out well. We were right about him, but he didn't get that many targets. I don't know. And I think this week his price has gone up. He's up to 11, 12% of your salary. And so, I think with defenses maybe shifting more to him, maybe a better value pick this week. And I could be wrong for Atlanta, which again, they could put up huge numbers this week against Pittsburgh, would be Mohamed Sanu, kind of the number 3 wide receiver in Atlanta. Could be wrong, but Sanu's a veteran. He's always going to get receptions. He's going to get targets there, and he very well could, score the touchdown, whereas Ridley just does not this week, and be a better pick. And then for solid picks this week, a little bit pricier, I guess. Devontae Adams, only 14% of your salary. This week, both Geronimo Allison and Randall Cobb are questionable. Even if they do play, they very well could be limited in snaps. They could be limited in performance. This bodes well for him. He's already the number 1 target in Green Bay. He could get even more targets this week. This could be a monster week for him. I mean, it could go the other way. Detroit could totally focus on him and shut him down, but I think he's a pretty good borderline value, solid pick. I mean, only 14% of your salary for this guy is great. DeAndre Hopkins, I'll leave him off this for now because maybe you can talk more about him. I don't know if you have him on your list, but he's 17% of your salary. Again, I think a solid pick week in and week out. Adam Thielen, again, not super expensive, 15 to 16% of your salary. He's been getting an enormous amount of targets and receptions, 56 targets through 4 games, 40 receptions. Those are huge numbers. Solid play week in and week out. I think he's going to continue to put up big numbers this week. And in some ways, he's kind of one of those matchup-proof type of guys. Diggs is kind of big play, a riskier play, but I think Thielen, he's going to get those receptions. He's going to get those yards. And finally, I have Golden Tate on here, 14% of your salary. Again, kind of borderline value versus a pricier player. 8 targets last week, caught all 4 of them, 132 yards, 2 touchdowns, a huge game. And I think he's going to put up pretty decent numbers again this week against the Green Bay defense. I don't, as I said earlier, it's not going to be a shootout, like 40 points each or anything like that. But I think he's going to get a fair amount of usage in what will end up being a pretty competitive game.
So when I look at wide receivers for me this week, I tell you what, there's not a lot of guys out there that I'm really comfortable with. So what I'm going to do in my scenarios, I'm going to invest heavier in wide receivers. I want to pay a little bit more money this week. But here's a few guys that I think could definitely be values for you should consider. But this week I'm going to play it safe there. The first guy is Marquise Valdez-Scantling, wide receiver for the Packers. He's only going to cost you about 5% of your salary. He's really cheap there. Now, you talked about Allison and Cobb being questionable. Well, sure enough, Adams just came up with a midweek injury, so now he's questionable.
I didn't see that.
Yeah, so right now you got everybody in that lineup's questionable, so we'll see. Now, for him to have value, it's going to take 2 of those 3 guys are going to have to be out. Between Cobb, Adams, and Allison, they're going to have to be out for him to have value, so you're going to have to watch the injury report. I wouldn't put him in now, but he's definitely somebody to keep an eye on there. If they're out, somebody's got to get that ball there. Another one out there is Tywan Taylor. 5 to 6% of your salary cap. So the Titans released Rashard Matthews, and they made him the number 2 wide receiver there, Taylor. He goes out this week, and he has 7 catches for 77 yards. We actually previewed him as a sleeper in our preseason videos. This guy's actually got a lot of talent there. He's a little bit underrated. Another guy out there, I like Calvin Ridley again. I do think you're right. I think he's going to get some attention from defenses. He's going to cost you about 11 to 12% of your salary cap. He's had 6 touchdowns in 3 games. But here's why I think that even though I think defense will start to watch this guy, I've got to go with him one more week. He's playing Pittsburgh. That Pittsburgh defense is brutal. They're playing at home in a game that should be a shutout. That Pittsburgh defense in the last 11 games has allowed over 27 points per game. I think there's a lot of numbers to go around there. If you're going to invest heavy in a game, that's the game to invest in. I think the over on that's going to be huge. Another one out there from that same game is Juju Smith-Schuster. Now, he's not cheap per se. He's going to cost you about 15% of your salary, but here's why I like Juju Smith-Schuster. He has wide receiver 1 talent. What I mean by that, this guy is just as talented, and his production is just as good as guys like Hopkins, Antonio Brown, but he's going to cost you considerably less money. So you get a guy that's got wide receiver 1 potential and value, and he's been putting good numbers out there, but at a lower cost. And so I like him there. And then Julian Edelman. 8% of your salary cap is going to cost you. He's playing Indianapolis. I like him. Now, I know Josh Gordon is back there, but last week Josh Gordon was only on the field with 18 of 81 snaps on offense. Gronkowski got an ankle injury, so I think Julian Edelman's in for a big workload there. He's his favorite wide receiver. I like him. I like Corey Davis. Only 8% of your salary cap versus Buffalo. He had a huge week last week, and he's a guy that is their clear number 1 wide receiver there. He's a first-round pick, 5th overall. Very talented. And then the final guy is Jerome Allison, going back to the Packers situation. He's going to cost you about 8 or 9% of your salary cap. And that's another one that's really contingent on Adams, Cobbs. Obviously, if Cobbs plays and if Adams plays, then his value is not very good. But if either one of those guys sits and he can go, right now he's in concussion protocol and he hasn't been cleared to play. At this point, it sounds to me like Cobb and Allison are not going to play. Sounds to me, from what I'm hearing, though, I think that Adams will probably try to get in that game. So.
Yeah, and that goes back to what you said earlier. You have to stay up on this all the way through, noon on Sunday, all the way through kickoff. You have to stay up on this. The Packers is a perfect example of that. Who's going to play, who's not going to play, because that could be huge. If Allison plays and the other two don't, he could have a huge game relative to his value. Same thing goes for Cobb, same thing goes for Adams, so pay attention to that. Let's move on to tight ends. Yeah, so for tight ends this week, similar strategy to what I did last week is I'm mostly looking for value, cheap. And, last week I played Benjamin Watson in every single one of my scenarios. So much for diversification. I put him in every single one. He was 5% of my salary. He was in the basement along with all these other tight ends, and I see him there. He's getting a fair amount of targets, fair amount of yards. He didn't explode. He almost caught a touchdown pass, which would have helped me out a ton in a lot of my scenarios. He didn't, but it kind of proved my point that, hey, here's a guy that's a lot cheaper, and yet he has the potential to perform just as well as some of these middle of the road in terms of salary options. So this week, my value pick, not picks, but pick, is David Njoku, Browns, going up against the Ravens. I think he's 5 to 6% of your salary, just all around a good value pick. He's getting targets, he's getting receptions. He's a touchdown threat, even though he hasn't scored one yet this year. I'm just looking for value. That's how I see it this week in terms of tight ends. Maybe you have a different strategy. You can talk about that.
Yeah, I'm kind of we've talked about this before, you and I. I'm a kind of a guy that I'm going to go just dirt cheap at tight ends, or I'm going to pay a lot of money to get a guy that I can trust. That's just simply how I'm going to do it. And right now, I don't think there's a lot of value in middle plays that are just so hit and miss. And so I don't mind spending the very bare minimum on a tight end. If he doesn't score a lot of points, hey, at least it was cheap. Guys that you could look at that are cheap out there, I think, is Antonio Gates. I'm not a huge fan of Antonio Gates. I love this guy, but he's past his prime, obviously. But he's only going to cost you 5%. He's going to be the bare minimum. We're seeing an expanded role there, but you need to know that he is touchdown dependent, really, to have value for you. Tyler Kroft. Tyler Eifert went down with an ugly ankle injury. I don't know if you saw that one. It was not pretty. I broke my leg back, and I watched. It was just cringy for me. But you know what? Tyler Kroft will probably move into that role. He'll probably get those targets. And last year, in relief of Tyler Eifert, he looked pretty good. He's going to cost you the bare minimum. Then another one out there is Jeff Swaim, tight end for the Dallas Cowboys. He's going to cost you about 5 to 6% of your salary. They're increasing his role. He had a touchdown last week. He's looking better, so he's a guy that I like. Another one that I really like, in the preseason, is David Njoku. He was hyped in the preseason, had a couple quiet weeks, but I think that was due to Tyrod Taylor not being very effective there. We said now that Baker Mayfield takes over, we expect his numbers to go up, and they did. He had 5 catches for 50-plus yards, so I like him. He's very cheap. And the other one is Benjamin Watson. I know he burnt you a little bit, but he's still pretty cheap, and I think that he's in a very good offense there.
Yeah, I mean, like all the receivers on his team or even running backs, he's just going to benefit from high volume in general. But he's the Monday night game, so some of you guys may or may not be playing with the Monday night game in your league or in your game, but definitely keep him on your radar if he is. Let's move on to defenses real quick. I think for defenses, I'll just let Rob lead this one because, I was looking through them and I didn't see any ones really jump out at me. To be quite honest, defenses might be one that I just go for the cheapest option. There's those 4 or 5 teams that are just the cheapest this week, and I'm just going to roll with them and be happy if they score 8 points for me or 10 points for me, or they get a pick 6 or something like that, and otherwise I'll kind of rely on my other players to kind of score the touchdowns for me. So who do you have for defenses this week?
Yeah, I think right now I've got 4 scenarios. I'll probably run a couple more. I usually do about 6. In one scenario, I did go with the most expensive defense, Tennessee versus the Bills, but I usually don't go that. I usually do exactly what you do. I go for a very cheap defense out there because they're really touchdown dependent, and so to really have value. But a defense out there you may want to look at, they're going to play later on tonight, is New England versus Indianapolis. They're playing at home. That defense rebounded nicely against Miami. Now, Luck is good, but he's missing some key players on offense there, so I think that's a defense that could be all right. Saints versus the Redskins. They're only going to cost you 5%, bare minimum. Now, the Saints D has struggled, but they are at home. And they're playing Washington, that in this game, I'm sure that the Saints are going to put points on the board. Washington will need to throw the ball. That's going to create sacks, strip sacks, and interception opportunities in that one. So I think there can be some nice plays there. You got the Ravens versus the Browns. They're going to cost you about 78%. The Ravens defense is good. Baker Mayfield looked good last game, but he's still a rookie. And they looked good last week, but it's against the Raiders defense that wasn't that good. So I think we're going to really get a good test of how that guy's going to be. And then the final one is Kansas City versus the Jaguars. It's going to cost you about 5 to 6% for Kansas City. It's not a great matchup, but Blake Bortles is always good for that one game where he just self-destructs. And this could be that game there. And so those are just some cheap things to consider. Anything there?
No, I think you covered it. Later on in this video, I'll give you my lineup for this week. And my defense this week is Dallas. I think they've played fairly well against some good reasonable, decent offenses. But again, kind of middle of the road. I very well could switch that later on, or in a lot of my other scenarios, just go with the cheapest option and roll with that.
All right.
All right, and so finally, and I actually shouldn't say finally because we still have to go over our lineups from last week and this week, but real quick, maybe you can start off giving some players that you see as overpriced or as what you call fool's gold, players to maybe stay away from this week.
Yeah, so for me, the overpriced guy out there is Pat Mahomes. He's going to cost you about 19-20% of your salary cap, but he's in many leagues a second most expensive quarterback playing the Jaguars. Now, last week, Denver actually slowed Pat Mahomes down and took 2 late drives in the fourth quarter to give him good numbers for the game, and the Jags are better than the Broncos defensively, and so I think that's something that could be overpriced. In other words, Andrew Luck going to cost you about 17%, but the loss of T.Y. Hilton in this game and then Doyle being questionable, he just doesn't have a lot of weapons there. And for me, fool's gold is Dak Prescott. He's fairly cheap out there. He's playing Houston defense that's not very good. I like Dak. I think he's poised. I think he's athletic. He's very talented. But his best receiver is Ezekiel Elliott, who's a running back. And then you got Swaim. I've talked about him. He's developing as a young tight end, but he's definitely not Whitney yet. And so there's just too many question marks there. Not enough solid weapons to trust this guy. And then the final one is Lamar Miller. I know you talked about him.
I know.
Lamar Miller is hard to avoid because he is cheap, and you know he's going to get the ball. He doesn't have to compete, and that's half the battle in fantasy is find a guy that's going to get the touches. Concern I have is that he's had great carries, good volume, but just not getting production. And Dallas defense, like you said, that defense is underrated. They've actually shut down a lot of very good running backs this year. I think Saquon Barkley, they shut down some other guys. So that's maybe Saquon Barkley. I think there's some other guys. Anyways, I don't have the list in front of me, but they've shut down some very good backs so far this year. So I'm a little concerned about him in that one.
Yeah, to add on to what you're saying about Dak Prescott, I mean, if you look at their receiving core in Dallas, what names stick out to you? I mean, Allen Hurns has turned out to be basically nothing this year. They have Tavon Austin. They have Cole Beasley, who I think is their leading receiver thus far.
Yeah. Michael Gallup, I mean.
And Gallup. I think they have one other guy, that a Thomas or something like that, who, not a...
Deontay Thompson.
Yeah, Thompson.
Buffalo, yeah. Buffalo cut the guy, so that tells you all that you need to know about him.
Yeah. I mean, again, Dak Prescott, I think he's got a good career in front of him. It's just right now he has no options besides his running back. My one overpriced player that I kind of came up with this week, wide receiver actually, is Antonio Brown. He's the most expensive out there, I think, at least for Sunday games. He's probably going to have a good week. I mean, he's had decent weeks thus far. As far as yardages go, I don't think he's topped 100 yards yet. And if he was going to, it'd probably be against Atlanta's defense. But I still think he's overpriced. I mean, like you were saying, Juju Smith-Schuster is a full, I think, 5% of your salary cheaper than Antonio Brown. I think Antonio Brown's a better option, but he shouldn't be that much more expensive. And I think he's a little bit overpriced. I'm just going to stay away from him. I can find value, even more expensive value, at wide receiver position, and just stay away from Brown altogether. But I know I'm probably going to get some hate for that because he's a very popular option, and hey, he's probably going to have a pretty decent game. He's going to get lots of receptions and targets. I just don't think it warrants, like 19% of your salary just for one wide receiver. So finally, we can move on to I think our lineups for this week, and then finally how we did last week.
Yeah, so I'm not going to talk about my lineup I have this week. I don't have that with me. You have that information. But I want to talk about last week. How did I do? Well, okay, so I previewed 22 players. And when I looked at them, there was 4 players that I was off on, and 1 player that was not necessarily bad. It was what I call fair play. And then 17 that we nailed. I look at that. It's about a 77% success rate. And I think that number is pretty solid. In fact, I think it's even better when you consider the fact that anybody can say start Alvin Kamara, Todd Gurley. But I think the key is finding value plays. So when you have to factor that in, it's not just about finding good plays, but those good plays that are cheap. For me, 77% success rate is pretty solid. I like that. So here's my recap. The first 2 weeks we did it with you. Week 1, I entered 5 teams. 1 was free. The other 4 cost $2. I'm $8 investment. I won $29. So that was modest. This week I went out, had 7 lineups. 1 was free. $2 ones, I entered cheap ones. I'm just not going to spend a lot of money. That's just not who I am. I'm not going to gamble that. But I did enter 6 at $2 each. That's a $12 investment. I didn't get in the money there. What I did notice this week, though, is I had 3 of my lineups, so I scored really good. And I looked at my average points there compared to other times in the past that I played. And those lineups would typically put me in the money, but for whatever reason this week they didn't. Others owners had other combination players that did well. Maybe there's some more scoring in the NFL, whatever it was. I didn't make money, but that still means that $20 spent, I had made $29. So it's not great, but it's a modest investment there. Last week here, the deals, these are the ones that we highlighted. That's 77% success. We talked about Joe Flacco, Andy Dalton, Matt Ryan, Deshaun Watson, Sony Michel, Lamar Miller, Kenyon Drake, Giovanni Bernard, Calvin Ridley, Demaryius Thomas, Allen Robinson, T.Y. Hilton, John Brown, Austin Hooper, David Njoku, Mark Andrews, Trey Burton, Chargers defense. We said Aaron Rodgers was overpriced last week. We said stay away from rookie quarterbacks. We said Ryan Fitzpatrick, stay away from him playing Chicago. That guy actually lost his job now. He's lost it. So, and then Kerryon Johnson, who I like, actually said he's fool's gold. And he had a good game, but he only had 9 carries in that game. So really, in a lot of ways, I think we nailed a lot of those picks. So.
Yeah. Real quick before I get to my performance last week, I want to give you guys my number 1 lineup, and this is subject to change based on injuries. But for the sake of this podcast, for this YouTube channel, I'm gonna roll with this one in at least one scenario, unless one of these guys is sitting out the week. For quarterback, I have Joe Flacco again, looking for value where I can find it. I mean, that's really the key. Value is great. And so, I mean, we want to pick the value players, and so that we can spend money on the Kamara, on the Gordon or Gurley. Because we don't talk about them as much doesn't mean you should stay away from them. It just means you need to find value elsewhere so that you can spend the money on them. Flacco at quarterback, Lamar Miller for running back, along with TJ Yeldon. Again, value there. Adams for wide receiver, and then Adam Thielen for wide receiver. Golden Tate, David Njoku, a bargain at tight end, and then Ezekiel Elliott for my flex position, and then Cowboys for defense. So I think that was my salary cap. I met it perfectly, and I know some people say, you shouldn't tweak your lineup. It's fine if you're a couple dollars under, but I did tweak it, and I don't know. I'm happy with that lineup. Getting to my lineup last week, my main one, the one that I said this is my number 1 lineup, ended up doing pretty well. I picked Joe Flacco, Alvin Kamara, Giovanni Bernard, Tyler Boyd, Ridley, Adams, Benjamin Watson, AJ Green, Chargers defense. Chargers defense was the one I think we both totally got wrong. They just did not do as well as we expected them to. But anyways, I think it's a half point PPR scoring system that came out to 155.12 points, which, like you said, usually be a really good week. It was a good week, but this was just overall a high-scoring week. In the game that I played that in, there was a total of 17,153 entries. I finished 3,017th, so top 20%. I was in the money in that one, which is good. But it would have been nice if I could have finished higher. But again, kind of had some dead weight with Benjamin Watson and with Chargers. Otherwise, I mean, all those guys panned out pretty well. I mean, they did what I expected them to, except for Watson, except for the Chargers defense. So that's how I did last week. Do you have anything else to kind of round this up with?
No, other than the fact that we'd love to hear your thoughts. Give us guys a lineup. If you were in daily fantasy, who'd you put in? Who do you have as deals this week? Where did you succeed last week, or who disappointed you? Just love to hear feedback. That's important to us. So
yeah, and I think 2 final questions that both came up here. Commented on them below. Who's going to have a better week, Antonio Brown or Juju Smith-Schuster? Okay. And Ridley or Sanu in for the Falcons. Same game, actually. Who's going to have the better game? Comment down below in the comment section. And thank you for watching this video.
All right. Thank you.